Today's occurrence happened in New Orleans, Louisiana, and is part 3.5 of the stories of Hurricane Katrina. If you have not listened to those, please go listen to them first so you aren't confused. They are the 3 episodes right before this one. Quick recap. When we left off in part 3, life care patients and memorial patients had been euthanized / allegedly murdered inside of Memorial Medical Center by Dr. John Thiel, Dr. Anna Poe, and others who either actively participated or turned a blind eye. Dr. Anna Poe was the only memorial doctor officially moved against in the court of law, but the grand jury declined to indict her. In part 2, I talked about African Americans being murdered for trying to make it to safety in Algiers Point by white residents. Black people were also dragged in the media that was fuel on the fire of mass hysteria from nearly non-existent looting, while white residents were portrayed as just grabbing survival items in the same camera shot. Some hospitals, like Charity Hospital, were abandoned and treated terribly by rescue organizers, but Charity staff did their job well to keep patients alive throughout the disaster, especially considering the staff-to-patient ratio was way worse than at Memorial, and compared to many organizations I'll elaborate on in this episode. I also talked about police killing unarmed New Orleanians, a major one being the Danziger Bridge incident on September 4th, where police reported being under fire near the bridge and hearing gunshots and people screaming, etc. 6 people were shot, 2 were killed. One being when New Orleans Police Captain Jeff Wynn and Lieutenant Dwayne Sherman shot Keenan McCann, alleging that he hijacked a water truck and was killing and raping people. Another shooting being Henry Glover, shot while trying to pick up supplies for his family after the storm. His brother, Edward, and a guy named Will Tanner took him to where police were set up at an elementary school to try and get help, and Edward and Will were immediately beaten to smithereens while Henry was driven off in Will's car by an officer, never to be seen alive again. I'll get to what really happened in both of those incidents and what caused Anna and other alleged healthcare workers in facilities around New Orleans to get away with murder, allegedly, in this episode. And now, just a reminder, all of this in this part and in parts 1 through 3 are all sourced from publicly available information. But obviously do your own research, form your own opinions. Don't come at me crazy, and do not put me on a list. As always, I'm Tatiana, and these are the stories of Hurricane Katrina. When Will Tanner and Edward Glover found themselves lying on the ground, bloodied while watching an officer hop into Will's car and drive off, with Henry still bleeding in the back, I couldn't tell you if they knew that would be the last time they saw him alive, just that it was. A week after that, an officer, Istvan, was walking around New Orleans and spotted a torched car. Inside, he found remains. In footage of him discovering this car with human remains inside, he is clearly saying that he could tell this person was murdered because the obvious to many cause of death, looking at this footage, showed a clear gunshot wound to the skull, and the severity of the car's burning immediately told Istvan and anyone else looking that this was no accident. Whosever remains were found in this car weren't meant to be found. Still, Istvan reported his discovery. He told federal authorities, the military, New Orleans Police Department, state police, honestly anyone and everyone he could think to report the assumed homicide or cover up to. He said no one cared. There was no concern from anyone he tried to get to investigate what happened. The remains in the torched car would stay where Istvan found them by the levees for another week before being taken to coroner Frank Minyard. 2 months after Henry went missing, his mother went to the 4th District Police Station, the same station mentioned when I talked about the Algiers Point racial shootings, and told them a story about how her son had been shot. Now, it's likely she couldn't go any sooner than this, considering the state of the city after Katrina. It was just in shambles. I doubt anyone would have listened to her prior to this 2-month mark anyway, honestly. But she told the officers there that she had been told by Henry's brother, Edward, that they had taken Henry to the police compound set up at that school for help, and how they had been beaten instead, and how officers took the vehicle with Henry still inside. Officers took her story as a missing person story and just filed it away. According to Henry Glover's sister, Patrice, her mother was told that police would come to talk to her, but no one ever reached out to her, no one showed up, no one even bothered calling. It would be 8 more months before Henry's remains were found and identified through DNA evidence and returned to the family for burial. And in the years that followed, lots of crazy stories went around about who killed Henry Glover. Some stories said it was family members. C.J. Thompson, the journalist investigating this and other buried Katrina stories, thought maybe it was a store owner protecting their property. In part 3, I hinted at some cover-ups / good old politics being the reason things happened the way that they did as far as Anna's trial went. I also started talking about what all led to the grand jury deciding not to indict Anna, but that was just the half of it. Now going back to Friday, July 14th, 2006. Before Anna, Sherry, and Lori were arrested, the Attorney General's office didn't want them aware of the arrest about to take place. It sounds like they didn't want the women to turn themselves in to try and avoid a perp walk, but also the way that they went about arresting them did not involve a perp walk. I don't know if they feared them being a flight risk or whatever, but that's besides the point. It was supposed to be more of a surprise than it was, but it wasn't, because Anna's department chairman, Dr. Daniel Nuss, had some high connections, and he was able to alert her and her attorney, Rick Simmons, that Attorney General Charles Foti was going to release the findings of their investigation up to that point, indicating that arrests were about to take place. Now, Charles Foti's public information director, Chris Wortell, was working like overtime to try and stop the train wreck that she saw coming from miles away, but she could only do so much when she wasn't exactly always listened to. Chris stopped them from going after the 3 women for first-degree murder, and she stopped the almost perp walk, but her efforts after that, well, so there was going to be a press conference that was given considering the international attention that this case got. And Chris wanted to go over possible questions Charles might be asked at the press conference, but he didn't want to go over them. At the press conference, Charles tried to explain the layout of Memorial and Life Care by saying, quote, "Memorial Hospital is a hospital in the city of New Orleans, a big hospital, been there a long time. Inside that hospital, they have another hospital called Lakeside. Lakeside has acute care patients." And that's where Chris cuts him off, whispering that he said the wrong name. She tells him, "Life Care," and he very obviously didn't hear her and turns to look at her, so she repeats herself. She had to repeat herself 3 times, and I don't know if he actually heard what she said, but he did not correct the mistake. Charles just went back to speaking into the mic by repeating, "has acute care patients," and he continued on talking. While talking, he mispronounced midazolam or Versed, calling it Mazdalone or something like that. He also said that either one of the medications can kill you, but when you use both together, it becomes a lethal cocktail that guarantees you will die. Now, that's not true. Medical professionals know that. The mixture can be fatal, for sure, no doubt. But if given carefully, it can be used safely. But of course, reporters didn't know that, and they ran with the quote, which, combined with the misnaming of Life Care and one of the meds, kind of ruined the seriousness and credibility among the medical community, which immediately, I imagine, gave them at least a little doubt. Speaking of, I have recently learned that I've been mispronouncing Versed. It's spelled Versed, which is how I've been saying it, but it's pronounced Versed, so shout out to the guy who let me know that info. LOL at me and Charles, but only kind of because my mistake wasn't as bad. I'm not giving a press conference on why I'm arresting people. Also, maybe midazolam. It could be midazolam, except I've heard doctors say it how I've been saying it, so we'll see how my brain decides to pronounce it from here on out while I'm talking. Anyway, Charles just had the women arrested. Actually prosecuting them was up to the Orleans Parish District Attorney, Eddie Jordan Jr., as mentioned in Part 3. That same day, Anna's attorney, Rick, got to work on his own press conference. He said that there had been no actual arrest, no motive, and no homicide, because in Charles's press conference, he made sure to emphasize that this was murder to him and not euthanasia. Rick said that the state of Louisiana was to blame for abandoning the hospitals, that the patients died from relocation stress syndrome, basically from moving them too much. And he skillfully avoided answering any questions about if people were even injected to begin with. So the Attorney General fumbling the press conference and Rick following it up skillfully was another reason why the grand jury possibly went the way they did, but that's not even close to all of it. There was a media blitz that affected at least one juror by their own admission on top of that. A local paper ran a multi-part story about what happened in Memorial based on interviews. Interviews including Dr. Anna Poe's 83-year-old mother, who claimed that she used to believe Anna was just too tenderhearted to become a doctor, and that the accusations against her were way out of character. That same article also said that Susan Molderick told her colleagues at that Thursday meeting that they would not be getting rescued that day, which was supported by interviews the reporter did, but was later said to be untrue. So, not seeming to be the most reliable of stories printed, but still part of what the jury would have consumed leading up to their investigation. There was also media specials on the battles other healthcare facilities went through that sympathized people. Lindy Boggs Medical Center, also owned by Tenet, was in a similar position to Memorial as far as having delayed rescue, almost no communications, and no power. They had no helipad, and they also had zero guarantee for ambulances for anyone that managed to get a boat ride to dry land for help. Staff there carried patients down multiple flights of stairs in sheets where the 150 patients were marked A, B, or C, C being the most critical patients. On that Wednesday, firefighters showed up at Lindy Boggs and directed the small boats that were grabbing patients to take them near a post office where a helicopter would pick them up. The acting chief of staff at Lindy Boggs, Dr. Glenn Johnson, described the situation like Auschwitz. He wondered if what he was doing with having to draw the letters on patients' foreheads was similar to what happened there, with people being marked like livestock. Firemen left Lindy Boggs before sundown, as they were ordered to do because of safety concerns. Again, thank you, media reporting. A few rescuers and medical staff came back on Thursday, the 1st, to take out people on a stolen boat, and the rest were taken out on Friday, September 2nd. Now, this coverage focused and humanized the experience of Dr. Glenn Johnson and the choices that he had to make with the insane heat, dwindling medicine supply, and lack of outside help. When he was flown out on Wednesday, August 31st, he and the patients he traveled with were dropped on the I-10 freeway like many others, and that story really changed people's perspectives and views of what medical professionals actually went through. It was another Dateline special, similar to the one Anna did for herself, and it mentioned that the Attorney General's office was looking into Lindy Boggs. But what that special left out was why the Attorney General's office was also looking into Lindy Boggs. Why they were focused on what happened after just about all of the 175 staff members escaped. Well, allegedly, fire officials suggested Lindy Boggs staff put on gowns and write triage symbol C on themselves so that they would look like patients and be evacuated by military helicopters. Some staff took pictures of each other smiling while wearing patient gowns on top of their scrubs. They had red triage letters written on their foreheads, hands, and chests. And they weren't planning to get all of the patients out in the midst of all of this picture taking. A respiratory therapist at Lindy Boggs asked what would happen to the patients actively being left behind. Someone told her verbatim, "At some point, someone will have to euthanize them." Lindy Boggs' anesthesiologist, James Riopel, was asked about euthanizing patients, but he says he had enough sense to say that the idea was just crazy. In James's mind, he thought, this is not the Titanic. Lindy Boggs wasn't going down. They're only 1 mile out from dry land, and they still had plenty of drinking water. There were rumors that officials were turning away civilian volunteers and their boats at the city border due to safety concerns, and rescue was moving slow, but he knew it would eventually gain speed. He knew they would get out. Why the heck was euthanasia even being considered? Honestly, the whole premise reaffirmed a choice that he made earlier in the day to stay despite orders from authorities. They would be leaving behind like 70 pets, including his own, just because a 20-something-year-old fireman from Shreveport told him to, not on his watch. A respiratory therapist and nurse director stayed behind with him. Though it sounds like when James made that choice, he didn't really consider what rescuers leaving patients behind would mean. James and the 2 other Lindy Bog staff that stayed with him were left not only with roughly 70 pets, because at least this place didn't appear to mass euthanize the animals, kind of, but the remaining 3 Lindy Bog staff members were left behind with about 25 extremely fragile patients, a decent chunk of who had do not resuscitate orders on file. James put 3 bodies of deceased patients at the entrance to the hospital to deter any possible looters. Now, for as much as I kind of applaud James's decision to stay behind, because it sounds like he stayed behind initially for the pets and not to take care of so many patients with so little staff, there were a few survivor statements that makes it seem like, for some reason, even here, euthanasia allegedly was suggested. Allegedly, the first evening there, a mother named Elaine Bias was with her 28-year-old daughter who was waiting on a liver transplant. Elaine refused to leave her daughter when she was ordered to, and she went on to say that James told her that she should put her daughter to sleep and showed her how to inject morphine into her daughter's IV line. Lindy Boggs' pharmacy was locked, but some of the other staff members allegedly gave James morphine for use in case any pets needed to be put down. Now, Elaine flat out refused because this suggestion brought forth the memory of an earlier conversation. She had heard from a Lindy Boggs staff member that certain patients were not going to be evacuated. The staff member told her, after they held an administrative meeting, that staff will give them morphine to put them to sleep. Another young patient who had just had a liver transplant was there with their wife, Jessie LaSalle. Jessie's husband was on a ventilator operating pneumatically since the power was out. Jessie claimed that James offered her morphine repeatedly. She said the guy told her no one was coming to save her husband and she should let James give her husband the morphine so he could go peacefully. Jessie kicked James out of the room, and James told her if she happened to change her mind that he would be upstairs with the animals. Both Jessie's husband and Elaine's daughter were rescued by boat the very next day. Now, James would claim that in the case of Elaine Bias's daughter, the woman claimed her daughter was in pain, and so James was just offering her the dose of morphine, but told her straight up the dose might kill her daughter because the liver was needed to break down the drug, but her daughter had liver failure, so might not work out as intended. James wasn't sure what a safe dose would actually be to give, but he just wanted Elaine to be careful when injecting her daughter. It was just to help her sleep. In the case of Jessie's husband, I think James denied offering it, but he did later say that if he had done that, it wouldn't have been dangerous for that guy or affected his breathing since he was on the ventilator. James said he didn't euthanize any patients. He vowed never to comply with misdirection after touring a Holocaust concentration camp years earlier. That's part of why he decided to stay when everyone else was leaving. According to James, Elaine and Jessie misunderstood his intention due to feeling abandoned themselves. 27 bodies were found at Lindy Boggs, many who were staying there from an acute care hospital, Genesis Specialty. That hospital was owned by another company, not Tenet, and it's believed that a few of Genesis patients died before the storm. Elaine claimed that she saw ventilators being turned off and patients without family members there to advocate for them being injected before dying. She believed they were being injected with morphine. Toxicology tests exposed that morphine was in about 25% of the bodies of abandoned patients at Lindy Boggs. It said that only one body had extremely high levels, though. Even though Jesse's husband and Elaine's daughter were rescued, they passed away a few weeks after from infections that their families believed were from lack of care and abandonment by hospital staff. And speaking of abandonment, a patient at another facility, Truro Infirmary, was left for dead but found alive. 70-year-old Odun Arachaga had a heart attack sometime before Katrina and suffered brain damage while waiting for rescuers who struggled to find his house while he was unconscious during that time. His daughter was actually told by a neurologist to let him die in the days leading up to Katrina hitting. She didn't, and Odun actually became more responsive and could breathe on his own again before Katrina. Well, the guy was found abandoned on the 3rd floor of Truro Infirmary on September 2nd by National Guardsmen. He had styrofoam coffee cups taped over his ears, and his medical records were at the foot of his soiled gurney that he was laying on. The guardsmen who found Odun ran out of there pushing his gurney and screaming that they needed help as they made their way to the smaller hospital just across the street. Upon examination, it was discovered that Odun's tracheotomy collar was saturated with crusty, dry, greenish-yellow sputum. His arms and legs were cold, his oxygen level was low, his heart was beating slowly. He was going downhill, to say the least. Rescuers addressed the immediate problems with him and got him loaded onto an ambulance afterwards, and he opened his eyes while he was being placed inside. According to Truro Infirmary staff, what happened was that they carried 18 critical patients, similar to Odun, from the ground floor to the 3rd floor. The ground floor had backup power when they did this. The 3rd floor lost power at some point. Staff moved patients because they were unsure how fast or how high the water would rise once they realized that it would. The hospital's generators failed because they were decades old and hadn't been tested in a very long time. The fuel used for them that they got from the government was said to be tainted. The generators were not rigged to work in most of the facility, and especially not to support the air conditioning. And the air conditioner depended on the city's water system for its chillers, but as we know, the water system was backed up, toxic, and just completely done for at this time. After power failed for ventilators and the backup batteries that they used failed too, patients were manually bagged, but not everyone's bodies liked that ventilation method, and some died. For triage, Truro staff did not give IVs to any patient who could not say their name. They tagged patients who were too sick to move with black and didn't take them to the helipad. Now, the whole not providing the same level of care to patients who can't communicate is absolutely horrifying when you think about the very common and not "this person is about to die" reasons behind that. In fact, it horrified the family of a Truro patient with Parkinson's that couldn't speak and died unexpectedly at Truro during this time. Same sentiment, in my opinion, as memorial patient Essie Cavalier, who could only say a few words, including mama, and maybe a few others who didn't speak but were written off and allegedly euthanized because of it, even though they were not remotely sick enough to even slightly consider the idea, but that's just me. And you know what the sickening gag was? Truro could be reached by land after Katrina. Not that it at all excuses things, in my opinion, but Memorial and Lindy Boggs were at least surrounded by floodwater post-Katrina. It sounds like Truro Infirmary wasn't. But the dang media reports. Truro staff were apparently just absolutely terrified by reports of violence around the city that we know were false, but allegedly they didn't. Truro staff would tell investigators, because of course Truro and Lindy Boggs were investigated after this complete foolishness, but staff told investigators that some people actually worked very hard to save patients, and others, like entire units of staff, drove straight out of the hospital garage without looking back and completely abandoned their patients. Some Truro nurses were fired and reported to the nursing board for abandonment, and they wouldn't be the only ones. At Memorial, 3 nurses from the medical and surgical unit on their 5th floor had been fired for being accused of abandonment. One was a nurse whose husband was the Coast Guard junior grade lieutenant and who was the guy that helped organize evacuating the ICU neonates that got out in part 1. Another was the nurse who went up and down the stairs that one night, bringing the phone back and forth. when the Coast Guard was trying to organize the rescue, that memorial leaders like Susan Muldrick didn't want to continue through the night, but the Coast Guard was trying to save anyone likely to die when the hospital lost power. That nurse, Michelle Petrie-Rials, and she was close friends with the first nurse. The first nurse's Coast Guard husband got authorization from the New Orleans Coast Guard sector to rescue his wife from Memorial's helipad on Wednesday afternoon, the day before the patient's injections. The first nurse decided to bring Michelle and another close nurse friend for the rescue ride. So those three were the ones fired from Memorial. Their leaving went against manager orders, and their coworkers were mad at them for leaving. The nurses still had a patient on the floor that they were working to, but the nurses wrote to Tenet, upset at being fired after their hard work, and they were reinstated and got their relief pay back. A fourth Memorial nurse was fired and not brought back, though. She actually took off the second the water started rising. Apparently, she was concerned about her pets, told her coworkers she was getting out of there, and the lady took off. According to Turow staff, the stories behind the abandoned patients and the large number of bodies was callous, in my opinion. Brent Becknell, an emergency room nurse at Turow and who was in charge of triage, said that National Guardsmen ordered them to leave for their safety and told them that soldiers would stay behind to protect the last 24 or so patients. Some people didn't want to leave but agreed to go because, according to Brent, at some point you just have to save yourself. But an anonymous Turow doctor wrote to the Attorney General's office and said that a military commander overseeing their evacuation told them that Odin was considered too critical to move along with 14 other patients. Staff, quote, shot them full of morphine and left them behind, end quote. Toxicology tests on some of the dead patients found at Turow and Specialty Hospital of New Orleans revealed high levels of morphine and midazolam, the exact same as Memorial euthanized patients. What's crazy but not surprising to me about Turow is that the company's CEO, Les Hirsch, bragged about the hospital's performance after Katrina. Like, he wrote an essay that the fire superintendent only gave Turow staff an hour to evacuate the facility because of violence in the city, and that the staff refused to leave until the last patient was safely evacuated. A letter written in response to that clearly false narrative copied the Attorney General and said that one nurse aiding the evacuation came upon 16 bodies in the building and many morphine vials all over the floor, suggesting that the patients were euthanized and others were left to die. The letter also warned, quote, someday the truth will be told, end quote. They got their wish, but not justice in the way that some hoped. Obviously, the public didn't know about all that extra stuff I just said, only what they saw in Dateline specials and interviews. While Rick could advocate for Anna in the press and deny allegations, investigators couldn't reveal what they had for fear of lawsuits and messing up open investigations. Rick's attack on the Attorney General included filing a lawsuit filled with incentives on Anna's behalf and sent copies of it out to the media. The lawsuit had everything in it, from personal attacks on the Attorney General to legal arguments. It mentioned another district attorney in another state, North Carolina, that had been disbarred for trying his case in the media and misleading the public about evidence that was later revealed to be false. Also part of why the Attorney General's office kept their mouths closed, except for Charles's first press conference. No need for disbarment and lawsuits if evidence gets thrown out or something and he blabbed too much in front of the cameras. The lawsuit also demanded that the state pay for Anna's legal fees since she was a state employee being a physician under LSU. Specifically the civil cases from families of dead patients, including Emmett Everett. The lawsuit pointed out what had been whispered among many who sided with Dr. Anna Poe, that the Attorney General just wanted to make the most of a high-profile case to help his re-election chances. In the spirit of keeping the public on Anna's side, Rick guided Anna through an interview with 60 Minutes, well, after she backed out from the interview the first time. Allegedly, Anna Poe did well during that interview. She even claimed that she herself was hope after being asked if she ever lost hope while in the thick of it at Memorial post-Katrina. That same 60 Minutes segment also interviewed Charles Fody, though it allegedly didn't paint him or his motives in the best light, in part because the person interviewing him was in a bad mood. Attorney General Charles Fody didn't come across well, especially to doctors all over America who claimed that he was a fool to prosecute medical professionals like Anna. Although, based on Chris Wartell's statements, Charles Fody's public information director, the moment the interview started, the questions Charles was being asked made it so clear that the story would be critical against him to her. Allegedly, Chris even argued with the interviewer for like an hour after the interview and sent a strong email to a network official about how she felt lied to about the reporter's intentions. Using the 60-minute momentum, Rick organized support from professional medical organizations like American Medical Association to release a statement in support of Anna, even though he didn't like when they planned to release it. The American Medical Association statement helped to push this idea, and the organization lobbied really hard for Anna, allegedly because one of the top executives of the organization was a head and neck surgeon, just like Anna. Part of the board of the Louisiana State Medical Society was a doctor Anna knew since she was a child, and they pushed Anna's case in that organization as well. Members of this group were urged to donate to Anna's support fund. They posted information about her fund on the organization's website and more. On their website, there was even a statement saying that her innocence should be determined because of how well her 60-minute interview went. All of this supposed support from the medical community got back to Dr. Frank Minyard, and it made him want to meet Anna and chat over coffee. Apparently, he did this with people he was investigating that were accused of crimes before. He felt that he had to go beyond science. He had to go with his gut, which, sometimes lined up perfectly with political interest of what's best for his buddies. Remember, I mentioned he was sued for refusing to release the autopsy records of the African Americans killed in the race killings in Algiers Point. He was also sued for not releasing the records of the Danziger Bridge shootings too. And somewhere along the way in 1990, he suggested that a criminal who died after being badly beaten while in custody of one of his friends had slipped on the floor, and that's how the guy became so injured. Frank had been elected coroner for about 31 years at this point, and right before then, recently winning another term after taking his only opponent to court and having them disqualified. Frank Minyard was 76 years old when this post-Katrina stuff took place. He believed his job was different from pathologists or medical examiners who used pure science to draw conclusions about the manner and causes behind suspicious deaths. Frank said he was a man of the people and felt it was his duty to really consider how his rulings would affect the community. Now, after that interview aired, I guess Frank got calls from people asking why he was doing what he was doing to that, quote, good woman, meaning Anna, and asking why she was even being investigated. Beyond that, Memorial's internal medicine specialist, Dr. John Kokemore, was a former coroner's assistant and part of Frank's staff and a close friend of his. And Frank had seen the guy all over the place on TV and otherwise defending Memorial's honor and Anna. Dr. John Kokemore was even in the 60-minute interview. When Anna went to meet with Frank, they chatted about all types of things, especially Anna's dad, who had referred patients to Frank when Anna's dad was a family doctor and when Frank had opened his OBGYN practice. So Anna's dad would send his own patients to Frank's whenever they needed an OBGYN. Frank Minyard didn't ask Anna anything direct about what actions she may have taken in the hospital. Possibly because Anna's lawyer was present during this chat. Possibly because he just didn't want to know. Frank did say that he felt like he would have at least tried to save Emmett Everett. There had to be a way to get the guy downstairs. And it rubbed Frank wrong that so few of the elderly patients that were injected even required or had been receiving pain medications prior to the injections. He himself had an ordeal during Katrina. He was driving back to work when the city flooded, and he had to get out of his car and walk, swim, and then catch a boat ride through the water. He was stuck for 4 days, and he couldn't sleep well. Clean water and food felt like such hot commodities for him at the time. And they couldn't even use the coroner's office after the storm. It was flooded. They had to move somewhere else. In trying to make a decision on cause of death, Frank sent out and requested information from independent experts. Forensic pathologists Cyril Wetch and Michael Baden, who met with Frank to determine cause of death, doubled down in writing that the life care deaths were from drug injections. Those are the two guys that Frank met with to go over the evidence, and they all three walked away from that meeting agreeing that all of them were homicides. Frank also reached out to 3 other experts for their opinion after sending them toxicology, autopsy, and medical records. Everyone determined that all cases were homicides. There was an oncologist and specialist in palliative care, Dr. Frank Brescia. He said all 9 life care patients were also murdered. Homicide. And this is a guy who specialized in the supposed care that Memorial staff were saying that they were trying to give patients, but just accidentally injected them way too much and killed them. And this guy is saying, no, that's not how that would work. They were killed. The president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and former chief coroner of Ontario, Canada, said homicide too. He was Dr. James Young, and he said verbatim, all these patients survived the adverse events of the previous days, and for every patient on a floor to have died in one 3.5-hour period with drug toxicity is beyond coincidence. A report by a local internist said that the medical records could have reasonably led to some of the patients' deaths, but most of the patient records just did not. In the case of Emmett Everett, the internist said that in his case, it's clear that he was stable medically and had no clear evidence that death was impending or imminent. Rick Simmons and his lawyer would stand 10 toes down claiming that Emmett died because of an enlarged heart, not medication overdose. The day after the forensic reports were received, Rick Simmons billed for about 2.5 hours of time spent at the coroner's office. A toxicologist was brought into Anna's defense team soon after that. It's possible Rick was allowed to make copies of the lab results from dead patients, as he had been trying to do so since they were tested, but the district attorney kept dodging because they hadn't actually formally charged Anna at that point in time, so they didn't want to send their reports to her lawyer. Now, the following month, still before the trial, it lends a glimpse into what led up to the grand jury decision. Dr. Horace Boltz visited Frank Minyard. Horace had actually long ago sent a letter to the Attorney General's office telling them to keep looking into possible mercy killings at Memorial when he suspected things weren't up to par after he left. Frank was aware that Horace sent that letter and he had seen it himself. Frank and Horace at this meeting sat there and talked about how Frank was in fact swayed by the 5 independent forensic experts that all agreed that the deaths Anna was accused of were in fact homicides, no question. But Horace could tell Frank felt obligated to Anna's father. Horace had also known the guy too. I guess Horace was a delivery boy in high school and had delivered prescriptions for Anna's dad. It appeared that Frank was wary. He could tell by the calls the office was already getting that international attention was on the case and that it would only get worse with an actual court case moving forward. Frank didn't like court controversy. Politically, it wasn't great for him or for the city, and he felt duty-bound to Anna's father. He seemed to know that the deaths were homicides, but it's like he just couldn't get himself to come out and say that. His job was simply to decide if the deaths were caused by the actions of others, if they were homicides. But he started his own investigation or something. Frank saw a bioethicist on a major news network after the news started reporting way back that there were possible mercy killings, and he reached out to the guy and sent the records of the 9 life care patients over to him. He wanted to know if it was possible that the circumstances in Memorial qualified as mercy killings as anything but homicide. The bioethicist argued on the news when he was on there that a jury could consider extremely extenuating circumstances as a legit defense in mercy killing. But after Frank sent the files to review, the guy said, nope, these 7th floor life care patients were all euthanized and that the drugs were not administered in a way that was consistent with the ethical standards of palliative care in America. The standards are very clear in saying that the goal of doctors' treatments cannot be the death of a patient. What happened in Memorial just didn't fit under palliative sedation. The guidelines by the American Medical Association stated that palliative care required consulting family members, documenting medications being administered, and things like that. Anna didn't do that. She had kept records. Doctors kept track of medication ordered by hand for patients until midday that Thursday, September 1st, just before the large amounts of known lethal drugs were given to patients. Drugs that hadn't been given to those patients prior at all, and who more than a couple were not even terminally ill. The family members that were there for patients that were injected were not consulted, like the daughters who were forced to get on boats. It didn't appear that there had been an attempt at all to do so. Not to mention that the daughters had made it very clear that they wanted their family members taken care of, rescued, helped, all the things. But the bioethicists knew, like many, that even in cases during this time period that were more obvious patient killings by physicians, juries had a hard time convicting doctors. Still, the guy told Coroner Frank Minyard the same thing the last, at least 5 other independent experts told him. All 9 of the 7th-floor life care patients were killed. It was homicide. On February 1st, 2007, a local New Orleans newspaper reported that Coroner Frank Minyard said he found no evidence of homicide. Investigators Virginia Ryder and Butch Schaefer, the ones who did most of the legwork in investigating this case, a case so big that Virginia was actually pulled off of other healthcare investigations because of just how humongous this one was. Those 2 heard this news and got in the car and drove the couple hours to New Orleans to Frank Minyard. Virginia put the newspaper down on Frank Minyard's desk with some force behind it while tears fell and asked him how he could do this. Remember, what I'm reporting is not even close to all of the details investigators had. Who knows what was said by Anna that her lawyer had locked up behind court records, ordered not to be released on top of that. The investigators knew the findings of autopsies, toxicology, independent experts, the works. So what did Frank have to say for himself to know all of this and say that there's no evidence of homicide? He told them there was too much local support for Dr. Anna Poe. It would look bad for the city to declare homicide. The media would go haywire. The city already looked bad from the news coverage during the storm, immediately after, and from how local, state, and federal governments acted and reacted. This wouldn't help. Frank said he had to consider what was best for the city and its already damaged reputation. And honestly, I think this broke Virginia Ryder. Now, when she would previously investigate doctors with high connections, she would get the occasional call from a politician or someone high up on their behalf. But this, to sweep the truth under a rug and report a lie, this level of politics, if you want to speak corporate, she had never seen it like this before. A meeting with Attorney General Charles Fody and District Attorney Eddie Jordan Jr., after the 3 women were initially arrested, had one of the men saying that survivors' chances of collecting compensation from corporations like Tenet and civil suits could be hurt if the deaths were proven to be from intentional acts from physicians. Now, Virginia had spoken to the very people they were suggesting might be money hungry, considering she was eyeball deep in the investigation and knew those people weren't money motivated. People like Emmett Everett's wife, who just wanted justice. Virginia offered to set up a meeting with Charles, Eddie, and victim families, but those 2 men just could not have refused louder if they tried. Putting faces to names when people might end up doing the wrong thing always makes it harder. Virginia left her position for a different role outside of state government after this case. Staying in state government, where the right thing allegedly sways with the political agenda, not for her. Virginia wasn't the only one upset, though. As far as I can tell, Butch had been in the state game for so long that he saw something like this coming from miles away, and he even warned Virginia not to get too caught up in the case at the beginning. Told her not to take it personal, not to get too involved. But outside of the state political game, colleagues called Coroner Frank Minyard highly upset. To a New York Times reporter that spoke to him, Frank sort of reworded. With that one, he said that he had not yet found evidence that it was homicide, and said that he wanted more evidence and reports before classifying them. I think the idea was that he might be honest to the grand jury because what happened in there would be a secret. It wouldn't stir the pot locally. But that didn't matter. Locally, where the jurors would be chosen, Anna's team drowned out anything other than that the coroner found no evidence of homicide. Even after that, Frank could just not decide what he would tell the grand jury. He reached out to another expert, Dr. Stephen Karch, a guy who put his entire career behind the argument that the amount of drugs found in remains might not be related to the amount in a person before they died. Like, Stephen Karch wrote a book on the signs of drug-induced deaths. He did not believe that you could rely on the findings in bodies after death. Dr. Stephen Karch was recommended by Dr. John Kokemore, who had recently reopened Memorial, but under the new/old name Baptist. Curtis Dosh was promoted to CEO of that new facility. Remember, John Kokemore was one of Anna's loudest supporters. But this Dr. Stephen Karch didn't think a single one of the bodies could say the cause of death. According to him, the cause of death should be undetermined. By all appearances, Frank agreed with Stephen's assessment that went against all of the independent experts and other pathologists' findings. The only other person who reviewed the evidence and agreed with the guy referred by John Kokemore was the toxicologist that Anna's attorney retained. But forensic pathologist Michael Baden said they were wrong. Even if you couldn't determine the amount of drugs in the dose victims, the drugs were still there. Morphine and Versed were in those patients and given shortly before death, and there was no other competing cause of death. Pathologist Cyril Wetch said, screw Stephen's argument. The amount found in the victims weren't just a little high or even borderline high. They were absolutely humongous. Cyril even tested Stephen's theory. He got samples from patients who died of drug overdoses and put them through days of humid and hot conditions, like the euthanized patients at Memorial. He refrigerated other samples from the same people, and there was no significant difference. Granted, this was a small test and not a legit study, but what proof did Stephen have? There was a popular show called Boston Legal that aired an episode of a doctor accused of killing patients after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Lawyer Rick, not to let anything get by him, got on the producers before the broadcast and tried to convince them not to air it. The grand jury investigation was about to start, and he didn't want the potential jurors moved by the show if that TV jury found that doctor guilty. Rick knew he couldn't get them to change the show's ending if it didn't favor his client, and the producer only would tell him that the attorney on the show rarely lost a case. It didn't sound like things would go in Anna's favor, so a last-minute effort to stop the airing of the episode was launched. A reportedly influential otolaryngologist, Dr. Michael Ellis, got colleagues together in an interview for a Louisiana medical newsletter. Michael Ellis was also the former president of the State Medical Society. He told the reporter for that newsletter that, quote, "It's abhorrent to all of us in the medical family that some of our most respected colleagues, well known personally to so many of us, could be so horribly and unjustly attacked in such a vicious and inappropriate manner. Shame on our entire legal community for allowing such a travesty to occur." End quote. The article didn't say anything about it, but apparently Michael had known Anna since she was a child and had taught her even at some point. The idea behind the rally cry was to get the episode canceled because enough public pressure had also previously gotten a book and a 2-part TV special on O.J. Simpson's case canceled. The day before the show aired, Rick Simmons spent a lot of time sending emails and making phone calls. He even went to the local ABC station for an interview. In that episode of Boston Legal, the middle-aged white woman with the same haircut as Anna was named Donna. The fake TV lawyer argued that fake Dr. Donna faced the challenge of having 5 patients with very painful deaths if she didn't do something. The TV lawyer mentioned needing to tackle the challenging task of making Donna look like an underdog. It wasn't easy because she's a doctor, and that they just needed to keep her out of prison. The TV lawyer argued on the show that the city of New Orleans was not part of America after Katrina. The hospital was a death camp. It was different. Conventional norms just didn't apply. Only TV Dr. Donna retained her natural sense of humanity by helping the patients go peacefully. The jury in that episode of the show found the doctor not guilty of first-degree murder. I don't know what version of the show ending Rick Simmons was given, but he ripped up the copy of it that he had because it was different than whatever aired. Now, because this fake TV show ended the episode the way it did, medical professional organizations took the opportunity to put out more supporting statements for Dr. Anna Poe, Cherry Landry, and Laurie Boudreau, as if this fake show proved that the women were innocent or something. The American College of Surgeons statement mentioned the ladies' acts as being those of heroes. The guy who wrote that statement was the chairman of the department where Anna trained and was super fond of her. The statement even said that Anna was forbidden to practice medicine, to keep performing surgery, that she was deemed guilty before due process, which just wasn't true. She had continued to do surgeries for a while and then voluntarily chose to stop briefly around the beginning of the court case, but she got back to doing surgeries during the case. Dr. Ewing Cook loved that Boston Legal episode. He immediately knew it would bode well for Anna when he saw it. He managed to stay out of trouble thanks to his lawyer, but he was never brought in for an interview by investigators. When the news that the grand jury selection was about to be underway began circling, his team went into overdrive with outspoken support, but in a way that wouldn't be too obvious to those who would see that and feel the need to speak out against it or call it out. They had leaders in the National Professional Organization for Head and Neck Cancer Surgery lash prosecutors and a press release for continuing with their agenda. They said healthcare professionals would refuse to volunteer in future emergencies. Anna's heroic actions should be rewarded, not punished. In contrary to the public perception that they kept pushing that Anna was not able to practice medicine anymore, she kept operating out of the public hospital in Baton Rouge. Public, allegedly because patients in public hospitals were more likely to be poor and less likely to sue, especially frivolously, unlike the financially stable believed to frequent private hospitals. At least that's what some of the New Orleans attorneys hinted at. Among all of these allegations, the state medical board did not investigate or sanction Dr. Anna Poe. Within LSU's system, she had sort of even been promoted, named the director of Louisiana State University's residency training program in her specialty. That position requires National Medical Organization's approval. More money was needed to continue funding the media blitz and Anna's defense. So in May of 2007, a disaster preparedness seminar and dinner dance fundraiser took place in Houston, Texas on behalf of Dr. Anna Poe. She previously learned and worked in Texas before. The celebration was fancy and well-placed in Texas, not Louisiana, making sure to keep it hours away from New Orleans, where such an event would not sit well considering the optics. During the seminar half of the fundraiser for Anna's defense fund, Rick, her lawyer, said Katrina demonstrated that a central top-to-bottom command worked best. He even used the Coast Guard as an example, even though Coast Guard people said that their success was because of people on the ground working hard to problem solve and save lives with flexible thinking and quick actions. Anna said at that fundraiser that the Coast Guard don't fly at night, and that was part of the problem. In a disaster, you need people who fly at night, and it's ridiculous that they couldn't do that. As I've explained in parts 1 through 3 now, we know that this isn't true. The Coast Guard even blew off their flight time rules to help save people. Anna said that what really rescued people in the storm was the military. Quote, "It was the Nighthawks, those big, giant Nighthawk military helicopters that came in and got everybody." End quote. Now, for one, the Coast Guard is part of the military, so yikes. But for two, it's Blackhawks, not Nighthawks. Anyway, her husband Vince, who apparently flew helicopters to rescue people after Katrina north of the city, said it was dangerous to fly at night because there were so many unlit towers. Anna said the employees working with her to serve the poor at the public hospital in Baton Rouge. Anna would also say that the employees working with her to serve the poor at the public hospital in Baton Rouge, described as rundown, were heroic and they were courageous for working there. Anna previously described working in Louisiana as working in a third world country. In that speech, she also said that people at Tulane, a rival medical school for LSU, had abandoned all care for the uninsured poor. But Tulane doctors in New Orleans post-Katrina were treating thousands of patients for free through clinics that they set up. Anna said that she hoped other doctors would stay in New Orleans to help bring back the city and to give people a little hope, even though she'd privately told many friends that she would never return to practicing there after what happened to her. Another doctor and presenter at this seminar cited a report that the Coast Guard did fly at night. The Coast Guard made some rescues at night using night vision goggles. So she was corrected. I don't know if people actually paid attention or if it was just glossed over, though. But for the dinner dance part of this shindig, 200 guests showed up, each of them donating $2,000 a couple to attend. People had such a good time at the event that one of Anna's friends said that she was telling Anna to get a new lawyer after seeing her lawyer, Rick, dance so hard on the dance floor that he was sweating profusely through his clothes. She thought it was unbecoming that he was so outwardly enjoying himself so much, considering the point of this event was to raise money to pay him. Anna's event raised about $100,000. And if her reciting incorrect information during the seminar wasn't bad enough, she cherry-picked information from other presenters to be misconstrued in their defense argument later on. One guy at the seminar presented a quote from the World Medical Organization. This organization was founded after World War II to set ethical guidelines for doctors. The quote the guy read said something like, "Patients whose conditions exceed the available therapeutic resources may be classified as beyond care. The physicians have to show those patients respect for their dignity and compassion. An example of this is separating them from others and administering appropriate pain relief and sedatives." It looks like Anna took the quote as meaning that instead of maintaining patient lives at all cost, it's okay to sedate them or administer pain relief if you believe they are beyond emergency care. Her and her lawyer ran with that thought process, actually. But in reality, the policy's definition of beyond emergency care was patients who had extremely severe injuries, like people with something like radiation burns severe enough that it was clear that they were not going to survive, or something very extreme like that. In fact, it even said that any patients categorized in that beyond emergency care category should be regularly reassessed in case the patient's condition changed or resources became available. Which is wild because, as we've heard, most physicians said it was completely unnecessary to euthanize the patients, and it wasn't even their job to decide to do something like that in memorial. But even still, let's say the patients were that bad, and it was the doctor's job. The helicopters were there evacuating people while they were euthanizing them. The boats were there. There were so many hours between them euthanizing the patients and when the rescues stopped going for the day. And even then, the people rescuing made sure to evacuate everyone they were told to get that day, all of the patients. And as we know with so many other healthcare facilities, the rescues continued the next day. They continued for many days after. But that was besides the point. Rick wasn't going to let Anna go to jail. He met with representatives of the World Medical Association, allegedly to get a grasp on how to present things to the jury when the grand jury convened. Him and Anna came up with the idea to really push this idea of the patients being beyond emergency care in the media. They used the term battlefield triage because to someone without medical knowledge, the term was enough. Hearing battlefield triage paints this picture in your mind of why Anna and the nurses did what they were accused of doing. The average Joe without medical knowledge would not know that this concept that they used for battlefield triage, reverse triage, was a proactive defense tactic by Rick, because it makes it seem like what the layperson would expect to happen during this non-applicable battlefield triage is in fact the reverse. Whatever you think Anna should have done, no, actually it's the reverse, but only a doctor would know that. Rick collaborated with the attorney for the owners of St. Rita's nursing home as well. They were scheduled to be on trial for negligent homicide due to the residents under their purview drowning at the facility. St. Rita's was a one-story nursing home in St. Bernard Parish that sat near the levees. They had over 30 residents drown when the levees failed, and the levees failing is a big part of what made this disaster so bad. Not the hurricane. Remember, that passed well before the flooding started. But the levees failing and how the disaster became something so catastrophic wasn't completely out of the owner's control. They were told to evacuate the facility before the storm. Allegedly, it was believed by some that the owners evacuated but didn't do the same for the people in their facility due to the expenses that emptying and closing the facility would require. Together, Rick and the St. Rita attorney went ham with a public relations campaign to smear Attorney General Charles Foti. They took turns feeding bad stories to the media about Charles. The nursing home owner's attorney, James Cobb Jr., was impressed by the deep pockets of Anna's legal team, and he would happily admit to the collaboration effort between their two teams against Charles as being a nefarious conspiracy. James Cobb Jr. would also be seen on air defending his client's decision not to evacuate, saying that they did in fact try to stay and save residents, and that their decision not to evacuate the nursing home, like the other 3 nursing homes in St. Bernard Parish, was not so out of pocket after hearing about another tragedy. After Katrina hit a few weeks later, within the same month, Hurricane Rita was projected to come through. It mostly hit western Louisiana and Texas, though, but there were still widespread evacuations. People left this time not wanting to experience the suffering seen in New Orleans following Katrina. But one nursing home near Houston, Texas, named Brighton Gardens of Bel Air, was evacuating patients to their sister facility in Dallas, Texas, but the bus caught fire on the way. 23 of the 38 elderly people on the bus burned to death when oxygen tanks in the luggage bay exploded. The charter bus used had an illegal license and was driven by an undocumented person. James Cobb Jr. used that story to show why it wasn't unreasonable for his clients to not have evacuated, especially considering Hurricane Rita spared Houston, but the evacuation caused an unprecedented level of gridlock. Again, no one wanted to end up like New Orleans, mere weeks after it happened and with its survivors still largely unable to return to the city. So it was like the Houston nursing home evacuated people and they died for no reason. At least that was kind of the defense for St. Rita. Moving people before a storm still had its risks. It's risky to stay, it's risky to try and go. Before Katrina hit, Ferncrest Manor Living Center was trying to evacuate their facility to Baton Rouge, but the buses they used didn't have a working air conditioner, drinking water, and some didn't even have nurses on board, so many patients died. I mentioned in part 1 how those who did try to evacuate were stuck on the road for hours longer than usual due to gridlock, and it's why many just chose to stay, considering the 24 hours advance warning people got to evacuate the city. Well, with Ferncrest Manor, it took them 4 hours to load the buses and 6 hours to drive from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, which is usually an hour and some change drive, an hour and a half if you take the long way. When the grand jury was planning to hear Memorial's case-related testimony at the end of April, the media strategy went harder. The push for health worker immunity in future disasters, statutory protections, was made. They made it clear in this media push that health workers wouldn't stay in New Orleans if prosecution went forward. I'm sure you've heard of qualified immunity for American police officers, the legal doctrine that protects police officers and other government officials from being held personally liable for constitutional violations unless they violated a clearly established law that a reasonable person would have known. It's criticized for allowing police misconduct to go unpunished and often protects officers from accountability in civil rights cases. Well, Rick and Anna pushed for the same for medical professionals, especially because during this time, many articles used Anna's case as a catalyst for considering new disaster medicine policies. So the American Medical Association, same one that Rick used before, had its annual conference, and the organization's ethics council actually held an open forum to consider if and how normal medical standards should be changed in disasters. They were going to vote on their campaign for doctor automatic immunity from liability in disasters, even if their care was grossly negligent. Rick was there to support both proposals, obviously. He spoke on how when medical resources were overwhelmed, some patients would have to go untreated and die, sacrificing their lives for the greater good based on physicians' fears for their own safety and DNR orders. This would lead to inevitable lawsuits, and this endangered doctors answering the call all over America to help during any number of natural or terrorist disasters. Rick advocated for protections when patients or their proxies' consent wasn't available. doctors couldn't document their decisions and had to decide on their own. He also talked about how public officials were safe from prosecution for some mistakes in judgment, so why not doctors working disasters? He advocated for complaints about a doctor's actions to be reviewed by other doctors instead of lawyers and judges, but to quiet the complaints of any self-interest, a victim compensation fund should be created to satisfy family of the dead. The American Medical Association delegates voted to develop legislation that would protect doctors working disasters from criminal and civil prosecution. It included the new standard of conviction being proving doctors set out with malice to hurt a patient. Members were encouraged to lobby this legislation all over the country. Now, to be clear, these protections that they argued against or wanted immunity for were put in place after the Nazis in World War II and all the so-called experimentations happening in camps and decisions military medics had to make and all that stuff. Rules and regulations are written in blood, and I should mention, this organization is not one a majority of doctors are part of. From what I could find, less than 300,000 doctors are actually part of it, and that number includes medical students, residents, and retired physicians, not just practicing doctors. It appears to be an organization many doctors don't exactly support due to their questionable stances and lobbying for certain laws to be passed in government. Less than 25% of doctors are in the organization. Now, with it approaching hurricane season, as this new strategy hit the media, those in need of help come storm time would be out of luck. So it just looked bad to indict doctors during this time of year. He made sure to frequently visit Frank, do conference calls, show up with documents, and then follow those documents with a letter with examples a few days after delivering the documents. Rick reminded Frank of the media circus that would happen and slow the city's recovery process. He warned Frank that his toxicologists and pathologists would fight over evidence in court. Two guys with checks at stake versus the over double independent experts that contradicted them, mind you. And then there were the overlapping supporter beliefs. The Danziger Bridge incident, the officers who were involved in that and other shady post-Katrina dealings were being investigated. It was this year, 2 years after Katrina, and Officer Istvan finding the body that A.C. Thompson stumbled upon the Henry Glover story. AC and some media corporations had to sue to get their hands on his autopsy, as I mentioned before, which they shouldn't have had to do, but the autopsy didn't say a cause of death when they got it. Henry's autopsy wasn't finished. Federal agencies were looking into the Danziger Bridge shooting because survivors and witnesses had much different stories than the officers involved. Well, the police supporters and the memorial supporters had the same argument, saying that the actions taken during Katrina should be judged differently. The dangerous and confusing environment of the disaster is what's to blame. These heroes should not be judged through normal ethics. Times were different. Police officers supported those under investigation and felt the investigations weren't fair. They felt that if something in retrospect seemed wrong, they were just doing the best they could with what they had. These were similar arguments to that Boston legal episode where the doctor allegedly based off Anna got off scot-free. I'm not going to lie, it looks like those who came out to literally protest for both of these groups were people part of the groups, like fellow police officers and police association members supporting their arrested colleagues and asking fellow officers to donate part of their paychecks to the families of the accused. So that's almost all of the media stuff that contributed to the grand jury's decision, in my opinion. I'll get to more very soon. Many of them saw the Dateline specials, but didn't know who was behind it. They no doubt saw the protest coverage, heard the radio host supporting Anna, heard about what a conviction might mean for the future of healthcare in the city. So you have all that leading up to the jury's investigation, and then there was what happened in the district attorney's office. For one, Anna's lawyer, Rick Simmons, was constantly reaching out to the DA's office, reminding them they don't have to file charges, that Rick was always available to talk about his 2 cents regarding the case, offering his experts to speak with the DA if he wanted, etc. And he succeeded in keeping whatever Anna told tenant attorneys about what happened at Memorial sealed from being released to anyone, including the DA. Butch Schaefer fought hard to get it released, though. The courts just didn't side with his argument. DA Michael Morales viewed the case from the point of view of the injections being to palliate instead of harm and kill. He felt like he was being asked to supply civilian law to a war zone, and he didn't really want to do it. His former student clerk, a sergeant with the New Orleans Police Department, was under investigation in the shootings of unarmed civilians on Danziger Bridge. Michael believed the guy was a very good cop and had a promising future as an attorney since the guy was studying law in night school or something. Allegedly, Michael didn't think people he felt were good should be charged for the bad things they did in a crisis. Within the actual courtroom, though, things also significantly led to Anna being set free. The nurses, Sherry Landry, Lori Boudreaux, and Mary Jo D'Amico, all got letters through their lawyers from the district attorney's office saying that they would not be prosecuted, but they were compelled to testify without counsel in front of the grand jury. Their testimony would not be used against them unless they failed to comply or gave false statements. And they weren't the only ones. Memorial ICU nurse manager and head of their ethics committee, Karen Wynn, got the same notice. Now, since the incident, Karen Wynn hadn't been apologetic or in denial in the very least about her actions and what happened with the patients inside of Memorial Medical Center, going as far as to say that even if it was euthanasia, it wasn't something they didn't do every day, just under a different name. She would say that it was the right thing to do under the circumstances. The only decision she questioned about their entire ordeal was sending her 16-year-old daughter out on a rescue helicopter from the hospital without her. Karen said her daughter had a difficult journey getting to safety, and it just broke her heart. A huge part of what I believe that had this attempt at indicting Anna fall flat on its face, Karen Wynn wasn't called to testify like the other nurses were. So people like her and Dr. Ewing Cook, who had no problem with what they chose to do, did not speak to the grand jury. Like, Karen got the letter, but she wasn't actually called in to testify in front of the grand jury. To many in Baton Rouge's Justice Department who spent so long working on this case, there were so many issues they took to how things went down in court. They believed essential evidence was ignored, and I, for one, agree. Now, the alleged mass or media manipulation on Anna's behalf, that seemed to have worked. When meeting with jurors after their decision, Butch Schaefer said the jurors spoke like they believed life care staff did not try to evacuate their patients or even care for them. The jurors appeared to believe that the entire case was just life care trying to get out unscathed after abandoning their patients. The jury had not been shown emails or text messages that showed how staff, inside and outside the life care system, tried to get evacuations arranged. How it was mostly Memorial leadership that barred culpability in the confusion behind the scenes, which will be explained in part 4. New Orleans prosecutors didn't tell grand jurors that the life care staff voluntarily reported what happened. They voluntarily said that information without immunity even. None of Life Care's administrators or employees that witnessed what happened were called to testify about the orders they were given by Memorial Medical Center or its staff like Anna Poe, Susan Muldrick, and more. The nurses given immunity seemed to have been given it without the prosecutors knowing what they would say. The operating room's nurse manager, Mary Jo D'Amico, the one that went with Anna to the life care floor, pretty much trashed life care during her testimony. She said life care nurses were sleeping on the job on the second floor on Tuesday night. Sherry Landry would tell the jurors that she injected up to 4 of the 7th floor life care patients on the 7th floor and 2 patients on the 2nd floor without actually knowing their medications, medical conditions, or even if they all had DNR orders like she believed. She just believed all of them were going to die. Jerry said one of the jurors looked familiar and that she could sense the jurors were on her side when she gave her testimony. Lori Boudreaux would say pretty much the same thing. Lori also didn't know the medical conditions or DNR statuses of 7th floor patients, just that they appeared to be dying. She injected 2 of them with a combination of morphine and midazolam. Now, both of these nurses' testimony had by admission at the very least violated Memorial's policy for sedative administration, if their goal was that at all. Memorial policy required a doctor to assess the patient, followed by informed consent. A medical order would then be recorded in that patient's chart and the patient would be continuously monitored with emergency equipment with resuscitation equipment ready to go if needed. The jurors weren't told about that policy. Then there was the fact that none of the many experts who were asked to analyze the evidence were ever called to testify. The several pathologists, toxicologists, medical ethicists, coroners, all those people that Frank Minyard sent information to for their weigh-in, none of those people were brought in to testify before the grand jury. Even Frank had specifically recommended the grand jury hear from all of the experts, who pretty much all believed the deaths were homicides. The experts were given a notice to prepare to testify, but none of them were called to actually do so, similar to Karen Wynn. The family members of euthanized patients who were there the day the injections happened also were not called in, like Wilda McManus's daughter, Angela, or Catherine, Elaine Nelson's daughter. And none of the memorial doctors were called in to testify without immunity. Well, outside of Dr. John Thiel, whose well-connected attorney was able to use John's illness to keep him out of it. John knew if he was involved, he was toast. His lawyer had told him he was at risk for first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, and negligent homicide, all felonies based on what he told the guy. John had also spoken to tenant lawyers after the storm, but his lawyer also managed to block whatever John revealed from being released to investigators or the public. Dr. John Thiel had quite a few fond memories during his time at Memorial, including taking turns with friends sitting in his car to cool off, listening to music while charging their phones, things like that. A few days after evacuating Memorial Medical Center, he actually had a stroke, but he recovered. The month the grand jury was selected, February, John had some pain in his abdomen that he thought was a few less severe things like a hernia or something, but he ended up having cancer. Dr. John Walsh from Memorial was actually the one who operated on Dr. John Thiel and found the guy had a tumor that seeded his liver and spleen and blocked and killed a large portion of his bowel. John Thiel had advanced metastatic colon cancer. The guy didn't recognize the signs he had been having for over the past year because of how stressed he was over being turned into the next Anna Poe. After the surgery, John Thiel didn't wake up. He developed a life-threatening infection in his abdomen that spread into his blood to the point where he was kept sedated and unconscious for weeks with propofol. He had been taken to the operating room and given blood transfusions 5 times during that time span. John Thiel was on a ventilator attached to his neck through a tracheostomy due to the severe breathing problems he developed. Ironic, given he was a lung specialist. But not the most ironic thing. He actually had very little chance of surviving his condition. And if he did, doctors believed he would have significant brain and major organ damage. Consider if it was better to just let him pass away or keep treating him bad. His wife wanted him to have the most aggressive treatment possible, and so did the doctors and nurses treating him. Most of them knew him. I believe he was an eyelash away from death for about a month and was unable to communicate during almost all of that time, much longer than those 5 days at Memorial, only a couple of those that were even spent without power, 0 days without food or water, and with much worse odds of survival than everything that went down in Memorial. John Thiel survived and would stand by his decision on injecting the Memorial and Life Care patients. No remorse. He was confident about what he did. He couldn't relate to their position. To him, there was a difference between those euthanized patients and him. It didn't matter that in his nearly 30 years of ICU experience, that he had probably never seen a patient go through what he himself went through and live. It didn't matter that he had actually developed every single sign known to predict very poor survival in the ICU. Every problem he had was potentially reversible. If the family of a patient went to Dr. John Thiel and asked him for medical advice, he would have painted a heck of a bad picture, telling them recovery was unlikely, helped counsel them through letting their family members go. But there was nothing that happened to him that couldn't get better with the grace of God and good fortune. When someone suggested that he got special care because he was a doctor, especially a doctor being looked after by other doctors that knew him, John would say that it wasn't the hands of man, it was the hands of God. He said, quote, "This wasn't the hands of man, this was the hands of God. I shouldn't be here. The fact that I came out with my kidneys intact, my brain intact, and went back to some degree of normalcy is just miraculous. There's no other word for it." End quote. When he recovered after being able to get out of speaking to the grand jury, but still during their investigation, he returned to work. He saw patients while wearing a chemotherapy pack. Although honestly, my opinion, the underlying racism that fueled so much of everything surrounding Hurricane Katrina was more outspokenly present in his choices. When Dr. John Thiel heard they were going to be leaving and any pets still at Memorial would be left to fend for themselves, he was certain another kind of animal would rampage the hospital looking for drugs. Quote, "What would they do? These crazy Black people who think they've been oppressed for all these years by white people. God knows what these crazy people outside are going to do to these poor people who are dying. They can dismember them, they can rape them, they can torture them." End quote. Allegedly, when he was evacuated to an airport, he was so terrified of all the Black people around him, and so were a lot of the rest of his staff, convinced he was about to be robbed of his watch because Black people spoke to him, while everyone was packed like sardines in this airport. Same self-concocted fear seen in white people who were evacuated from New Orleans but were surrounded by Black people until they got out, just absolutely convinced and saying with their entire chest that they were surrounded by niggers and not animals. That's a direct quote. Convinced of this, even though the Black people weren't even paying attention to them, like in some cases where people were saying that there's footage, right? They're not even being paid attention to, but I digress. When a nurse was asked about him at the grand jury, she didn't spill the beans. She didn't say that Dr. John Thiel injected patients himself, or had even admitted to doing so to a horrified Dr. Horace Bolts and others. The nurse just said that she knew Dr. John Thiel and said he was a good doctor. That's pretty much it. John Thiel did not speak to the grand jury. Dr. Horace Bolts wasn't called in either, and he was one of the several doctors who actually reached out to the prosecutors supporting this case. And lastly, they didn't even bother calling in Virginia Ryder, who was the one who did most of the legwork in this case and getting it to this point and wanting to see justice instead of shady politics. In fact, it's crazy because hearsay is allowed at a grand jury. It's common for lead investigating agents like Virginia to summarize the evidence to jurors. She could tell them what she had been told or what other people had said they heard from people who were in Memorial. Like, all of that could have been allowed to be said in the grand jury investigation. Virginia, who knew just about everything relevant to Memorial Medical Center that I have explained through this series, who would have explained all of this to jurors without question, was not called in to speak to them. They never heard from her. Now, almost all of the stuff that I just mentioned that happened inside of the courtroom, just about all of it, was written in a letter by an assistant attorney general concerned with how it was going. She included all of what I just said, minus the stuff about Dr. John Thiel. It doesn't seem like the ADA course corrected or wanted to, for that matter. As for Coroner Frank Minyard in court, he was torn, and it didn't help that he was informed that other doctors at Memorial did the same thing as Dr. Inapo, but he couldn't bring himself to actually investigate alleged perpetrators and additional deaths. He knew that if he was in Memorial doctors' positions, he wouldn't have gone around and shot up patients with syringes filled with drugs to kill them because someone told him to leave the hospital because it was being closed down at 5 or something. Not that he was saying Anna had done it, it's just not what he would do, even if he wasn't totally sure what he would actually do. But he struggled most with Emmett Everett's death. That one, hands down, straight up homicide. Frank had no problem betting his life on that one. Frank considered being clear with the jury about Emmett's death, that he died without question from the drugs. He figured if he was clear on Emmett's death being a murder and fuzzier about explaining the other deaths, saying that they might be homicides, but he just couldn't be certain. Rick should have an easier time defending Anna in court if she was indicted on just Emmett's death alone. Rick could say something like, Anna was trying to sedate everybody, but due to Emmett's size, she overestimated how much sedation he would need if Rick had to defend her in court. And that was the play that Frank Minyard went with. But the final nail in the coffin for the grand jury choosing not to indict Anna? During the last week or so of the grand jury investigation, Attorney General Charles Foti called into a radio show, the host of which was beloved due to his marathon broadcasting during Hurricane Katrina. The host name is Garland Robinette. Garland accused Charles of driving nurses and doctors out of the state. He told Charles the whole city was angered by what Charles had done to Anna, Sherry, and Lori. Charles hung up in the middle of the broadcast. So Garland urged his listeners to rally in support of Anna that evening at a city park to tell the Attorney General to drop his case because there's more important things to do in the city. Garland wanted to bring Charles as low as the prosecutor I mentioned earlier who had been disbarred in another state. That prosecutor was named Michael B. Nifong, and that guy was trying to prosecute several Duke University lacrosse players for allegedly raping a woman. Supporters of Charles Foti's opponent in the upcoming election actually showed up to the rally, and they were wearing campaign stickers. Other people had signs saying, Foti is another Nifong, and the words, they stayed. So basically, this attorney general is the same as the one that was disbarred in North Carolina for whatever kind of false evidence, whatever happened there, and also saying that these healthcare workers stayed to help people during the storm, and they're being prosecuted. ICU nurse Kathy Green spoke at the rally in support of Anna, saying that she was carrying the burden for the whole hospital and that they must get her exonerated. Kathy Green was a die-hard believer in the decisions they made in Memorial. She felt like they were asked to play God every day in the ICU, and while she didn't believe in killing people, she also didn't see the point in dragging out a death instead of just giving painkillers. When she was at Memorial, ICU doctors, like Dr. Ewing Cook, would write orders that gave nurses like her a lot of leeway with a lot of stuff. That was the culture she embraced in Memorial Medical Center, and when Memorial closed for a while and she was forced to work in another hospital, she noticed patients weren't given as much sedation. She didn't like it. Based on hers and other staff comments, it appears that Memorial had this culture of over-medicating patients and allegedly ending life or going against sworn oaths under questionable circumstances, which possibly is part of why they didn't hesitate to just inject patients. In fact, she actually told her daughter that if it came down to it, for her daughter to take her to Holland, where euthanasia was legalized in cases of unbearable suffering, Kathy Green wanted euthanasia normalized in medicine. She felt like it was the race card, with people too scared to even speak of it. One of Anna's brothers spoke at that same rally, along with a clergyman and Dr. Daniel Nuss. These speakers aimed their remarks at the grand jury, who was not sequestered and could watch the rally on the news. They warned that medical professionals would flee Louisiana in droves if a doctor was indicted after working through a disaster. They read a joint statement from the American Medical Association and American Nursing Association, warning, quote, that strong consideration be given to the harmful repercussions of continuing the prosecution of this case. Healthcare professionals had already begun moving from the area after the hurricane and hadn't returned, even though it had been 2 years post-Katrina at this point, just due to so many other people being sent away, families split up, locals not returning to the city due to so many factors. And if the people you're supposed to treat are gone, you have no clientele there anymore, so they left, they moved, and they just hadn't returned. To this day, it's actually still like that for many. To this day, the city still hasn't recovered, but that's something to be addressed in part 4. Dr. John Thiel attended that rally too. The same man who told his lawyers to declare him too sick to speak to the grand jury and was working while allegedly being too sick, he was at the rally while they were still investigating and around the time that they came to their decision. Dr. Horace Bolts also attended that rally, much to his disgust about the actions of medical professionals. Horace didn't like the so-called professionals holding a gun to the community's head and basically saying, do what we want or we will abandon our patients. It was a constructed and hysterical response in levels that he says he's never seen to such serious allegations. Anna wasn't at the rally, but her husband recorded videos of it for her. She was actually performing surgery at the public hospital she worked at in Baton Rouge at the time. The same week of the rally, the grand jury decided they did not want any more evidence or to investigate any more and declined to indict Dr. Anna Poe. The press conference that followed the lack of indictment had the assistant attorney general that wrote the letter to ADA Michael Morales saying that they still believed it was a homicide. The press conference from Anna's side following the acquittal had her refusing to say if she did in fact even inject the patients or what her motivations for doing so were if she did, saying that the civil cases she was still involved in might use what she said against her or that another grand jury could bring murder charges because in the state of Louisiana, there's no statute of limitations for murder. District Attorney Eddie Jordan Jr. would tell the press that he agreed with the grand jury, which was shocking to many. Michael Morales would later say that he actually didn't care one way or the other about the outcome of the case. What he felt should be learned was people should evacuate before storms. I guess it's, screw anyone who can't and those who are at the mercy of the healthcare facilities they resided in. Michael would also eventually admit that he and District Attorney Eddie Jordan Jr. weren't exactly happy to be prosecuting the case and that his direct boss, ADA Craig Famularo, was ambivalent towards it. Michael would actually say that they were going to give Anna deference and not really rush to indict her, but since there were multiple witnesses willing to testify and a judge signing an arrest warrant for Anna, they had to try the case. Attorney General Charles Fody would continue urging that this was murder and someone should be punished. His staff gave out copies of the forensic reports saying that the patient's deaths were homicides to press at a conference. And they even criticized the grand jury for not hearing from the family of the dead and from those same experts. Then he went on to publish an op-ed supporting his stance that if Anna was actually under pressure, it still does not excuse her alleged actions. After releasing the findings of forensic experts, dozens of hospital employees allegedly involved with these injections fought against it, hiding behind the names of John and Jane Doe's to sue to stop the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit's thousands upon thousands of pages of investigative records from being released to the public. Anna Poe supported the Jane and John Doe side, and in 2012 it was determined that those files would stay sealed. The other case that Charles's investigative unit put together against the St. Rita nursing home's owners, Mabel and Sal Mangiano, they were the ones whose lawyer James Cobb Jr. teamed up with Anna's team for that media blitz against the Attorney General. Well, a jury in St. Francisville, Louisiana, acquitted them too, on all 35 counts of negligent homicide and 24 counts of cruelty to the infirm. Anna Poe supporters kept up their campaign to unseat Attorney General Charles Fody, just like they said they would, and they succeeded. He lost his re-election bid 6 weeks after the St. Rita acquittal, and because of that, when he left office, his Medicaid Fraud Control Unit was forced to close their investigations into other healthcare facilities, like Lindy Boggs, where all but 3 staff abandoned the patients and pets, and allegedly, the one guy was going around urging family members to put their loved ones to sleep permanently, and remains were found there with morphine in them. It stopped the investigation into Turo Infirmary, where patients were also injected by staff based on their own admissions before fleeing, and Odin Arachaga was left for dead, but later found alive. I mean, this caused federal aid in investigations in other hospitals and nursing homes that could have been criminal to also be shut down. They used the results of the Memorial and St. Rita's cases as their reasoning for doing so. So Anna's case led to the other facilities, even ones I haven't even mentioned and who may not have had the chance to be investigated even, get off scot-free. By 2009, several media companies would join forces in reporting the Danziger Bridge shooting. that killed 2 and injured 4. Survivors would report that they never fired guns or had weapons of any sort on them. 6 New Orleans Police Department officers would be indicted in that case. The grand jury for it actually happened right before the one convened for Anna's case. The FBI investigating reconstructed what police told them happened. Police involved in the bridge shooting said that the incident started when New Orleans Police Department officers commandeered a budget rental truck to respond to a distress call on the bridge. Police said they heard on the radio that officers were under fire. One officer said he fired warning shots out of the truck's window, and almost immediately the other officers poured out of the truck and fired their guns. Federal prosecutors would say that there was no evidence police were under threat. Actually, they were firing on unarmed civilians, hurricane survivors just searching for medicine and food. So what actually happened? It's my understanding that there were about 8 civilians involved from 2 families. The distress call happened when New Orleans police officers escorting a civilian convoy on the I-10 high-rise, which is a highway parallel to the Danziger Bridge, reported someone shooting on the ground. The impression that they gave over the radio was that a police officer was down or injured under the Danziger Bridge. So a group of at least 9 police officers snatched a budget rental truck from the 7th District makeshift station in eastern New Orleans and headed towards the bridge. At the same time, there were 2 or 3 people in the Bartholomew family seen on camera pushing a grocery cart up the Danziger Bridge. Another member of that family, Jose Holmes, was seen running towards the bridge before he stopped to tie his shoe. The Bartholomew family is doing this just moments before the police arrived. Police said they were shot at as they approached and returned fire. A barrage of bullets came from the police officers as they leapt out of the truck, so the Bartholomew family jumped behind a concrete barrier that lined a pedestrian walkway, just trying to get shelter from the bullets. 4 members of the Bartholomew family were injured. 19-year-old Jose Holmes, who couldn't tell you how many times he was shot at the time, just that it felt like World War II. It hurt. He didn't think it would stop. He thought it was the end. The guy honestly didn't know what to think. He was just lucky to survive when his 17-year-old friend, James Brissett, died right next to him on the scene. Further up the bridge, Officer Michael Hunter, who later pleaded guilty to obstruction charges, witnessed Sergeant Robert Gisevius fire an M4 rifle at different groups of civilians, including a Lance and Ronald Madison. Officer Michael Hunter then drove the budget truck that was commandeered to the crest of this bridge, where he, Sergeant Robert, and Officer Robert Falcon got into an unmarked car that a state trooper was driving. They drove the car down the bridge, chasing after Lance and Ronald Madison. While still in the car, Officer Robert Falcon shot Ronald Madison in the back, where he collapsed in the driveway of a motel that branches right off the bridge. Lance was unharmed, but arrested at the bottom of the bridge and booked on attempted murder of police officers. He would later be cleared on all charges by a state grand jury. 41-year-old Ronald Madison, who was mentally disabled, was shot in the back and repeatedly kicked while he was dying. He and Lance made up the Madison family. Within the Bartholomew family, Leonard Bartholomew III, Susan, Leisha, and Jose were injured. Leonard IV was unharmed, and James, Jose's friend, was killed. Anyone shot was shot multiple times, they had multiple bullet wounds. According to the press release from the United States Attorney's Office, Eastern District of Louisiana, it says 5 New Orleans police officers pled guilty and were sentenced in connection with the federal civil rights prosecution of a police-involved shooting that occurred on the bridge. They also pled guilty and were sentenced for their roles in an extensive cover-up of the shooting. Kenneth Bowen, Robert Gisevius, and Anthony Villavasso all pled guilty to similar charges, including depriving people of their rights while acting as law enforcement, conspiring to obstruct justice, and obstructing justice by using misleading conduct. Kenneth Bowen received 10 years in prison. Robert Gisevius also got 10 years in prison, and Anthony Villavasso got 7 years in prison. All 3 of them have up to 5 years of supervised release upon their release. Kenneth Bowen and Robert Gisevius were sergeants. Robert Falcon pled guilty to similar charges, but he received a slightly different sentence. His charges include depriving people of their rights while acting as law enforcement, conspiring to obstruct justice, and obstructing justice by using misleading conduct. Robert Falcon got 12 years in prison and up to 5 years of supervised release upon release. And lastly, Arthur Kaufman pled guilty to 2 obstruction-related charges: conspiracy to obstruct justice and falsifying evidence to obstruct justice. Arthur Kaufman was sentenced to 3 years in prison and up to 5 years of supervised release. He was a sergeant and helped with the huge cover-up. Their sentencing didn't happen until 2016, and a police oversight board in Louisiana didn't permanently strip credentials from them until 2023. Now, the sentences I just mentioned for the Danziger Bridge officers weren't what they were originally sentenced to. So it turns out that originally they were sentenced to terms ranging from 38 years to 65 years, depending on their level of involvement, but due to prosecutorial misconduct, because of press leaks and comments that prosecutors and those involved in charging these officers made online, they managed to get a retrial. And in that retrial, they were still deemed guilty. The judge still said that you guys are charged with this, but their sentences were knocked down to this 3 to 12-year range that I just mentioned. As far as Henry Glover's case went, C.J. Thompson's investigative journalism actually is why the case was investigated, and it led him back to Bernard, who was with Henry that day. Bernard told CJ that Henry was grabbing items that had been taken from the shopping center and put inside of luggage. It had candles, pots, pans, and things like that. A family member had asked Henry to go pick it up. Henry and Bernard went to the shopping center and parked it, and they both got out to pick up the stuff, and Bernard heard someone say, "Leave now," and fire a shot like at the same time they were yelling, "Leave now." Bernard said he just knew it was a cop because it was right near the police station, and based on the guy's actions, how he said the order, and just the overall feeling and demeanor of what happened. That's where the investigation into who killed Henry Glover stalled for a while, until a source found a report of a police shooting that day. New Orleans Police Department denied reports of a police shooting that day, but the uncovered report said 42-year-old rookie cop David Warren had been involved in a shooting that day, September 2nd, 2005. It said David was on duty at the Strip Mall police substation. On the second floor of that mall Henry was at, there was a police substation during Katrina. David was on duty there, and he said he came out of the substation because he heard a truck being driven fast and erratically. The 2 unknown black men who stepped out of the truck were menacing to him, and he felt like his life was in danger and scared for his life. You know the story. So he fired 1 shot. David claimed he missed, and he was unsure if he actually even hit anyone. But the balcony diagonal to the parking lot makes that really hard to believe because it's a super clear line of sight, and Henry was shot right next to the truck. And honestly, the truck is parked like practically under the balcony David fired from. So it's hard to believe he didn't see what he was doing or who he hit. But after being shot, Henry stumbled about 50 yards down the street before Will Tanner picked him up and they drove to the school looking for medical attention. Will says if he knew a cop shot Henry, there was absolutely no way at all that he would have taken him to that school for help. He would have known that they would not have gotten help. Will says they were beaten until a lady cop intervened that knew Will. The lady cop asked what Will and Edward did, and a cop responded, "Those niggers over there looting." The officers assumed that the men were looting, even though there wasn't anything in Will's vehicle that was new or even suggested looting was happening. But that unfinished report, well, it said that the truck bringing Henry to the school was driving erratically and being chased by police cars. It also said that the man in the back seat was already dead and that Will and Edward refused to cooperate with police. The report said officers handcuffed the men, and there was not a single mention of beating anyone, burning anything, especially a car or body. It does say that the car was driven behind the 4th District Police Station by the levee, and that the body was secured until it could be taken to a makeshift morgue for autopsy. But even if that were true, it raises questions, like why was there not a report done about someone being shot? That would most obviously be due to a crime. How did Henry's remains end up in a burnt car a block away from where the police said they left it? And why is it that Henry's unfinished report, with so many holes and questions, was also signed off by the same guy who signed off on the falsified Danziger Bridge report? How was a guy who was last seen having been shot in the torso also found with a bullet hole in his skull? In June of 2010, a federal grand jury returned charging 5 officers with 11 federal civil rights violations. Rookie cop David Warren was charged with murder, as he is said to have used an assault rifle to shoot and kill Henry Glover from where he was on the balcony. Lieutenant Dwayne Sherman, same guy from the water truck response and the beating, was charged with using unreasonable force for beating Will and Edward, and charged with setting fire to Will's car with Henry's remains in the backseat. They also charged Gregory McRae, Robert Italiano, and Travis McCabe for their parts in the cover-up. Federal prosecutors said that there was a clear cover-up, but honestly, they could not say just how far up it went. They charged 2 officers from the 4th District station that were involved with the cover-up, and they said it was so clear that multiple people knew David shot Henry, they knew Henry was taken to Haben School for help, and they knew Henry's body was burned on the levee. Federal prosecutors said that police knew all of this from the very beginning, but knowingly altered, concealed, and covered up what really happened. Something that was crazy to me, but not surprising given what we know, was Coroner Frank Minyard's part in this case. He went on record saying that he didn't know the cause of death because he only got a bag of bones or something like that in the morgue. He assumed fire was the cause of death, but he just couldn't say for certain. He said the guy could have shot himself or caught himself on fire. He didn't know the body came out of a car because there was no tags or info attached to it. Kevin Whaley, a forensic pathologist from New York that came to help with autopsies after Katrina, actually saw Henry's remains, though. Kevin said Frank's own people told him where the remains came from. Kevin was told they were found in a burnt-out car, and that was more than enough to be automatically suspicious. Remains in a burnt-out car, to the degree of charring and disruption that Henry's were, suspect is all get out. Kevin said normal car fires usually leave remains with near pristine internal organs. Like if Henry was in the car and it just happened to catch fire in a more normal way and not in a criminal way, then he would not be burnt to the bone. Like you can do a full autopsy on people in normal car fires just like anyone else. But considering everything was gone, Henry was literally just a skeleton, bones, and he was found by Istvan a week after being shot, so it wasn't like he was decomposed to that point over a long enough time, given environmental conditions and things like that. It was out of the ordinary, to say the least. Kevin didn't actually see the video of Henry's remains that Istvan took when he stumbled upon them originally so that he could show the video to authorities when he was trying to file reports to get it investigated. Kevin didn't see that video until CJ Thompson showed him during an interview, and honestly, seeing the video just increased Kevin's suspicions. Seeing the state of the car and the remains, like, it is so clear. I've seen the video. It's so clear that someone was trying to, like, completely disintegrate Henry's body and the car. No questions asked. That was not an accidental fire by any means. Like, they were trying to get rid of every piece of evidence possible. And what's crazier is that by the time Henry's remains even got to Kevin, his skull was gone. So the gunshot wound that's seen clearly in the footage that Istvan took, it's gone because the skull's not there. Kevin was able to tell that this was suspicious simply because the rest of the skeleton that he got from Henry and the fact that people said he was found in a burnt-out car, you know, it's like 2 + 2 is an equaling 4. But seeing all of the evidence, the full video with the skull and the gunshot wound to the head, yeah, Kevin's like, this is suspect. CJ mentioned that someone could have gotten rid of the skull on purpose, and Kevin agreed that any number of reasons could have led to the skull disappearing. He said it could be someone hiding the skull if it revealed too much information, or it could have just been misplaced. But that in itself is like so suspicious because how do you misplace a human skull? You know, altogether, like the whole thing is so suspicious for foul play or homicide. Now, Frank never classified the death, leaving that line on Henry's autopsy blank. And when Frank was asked about Kevin's take on Henry's death and how suspicious it was, including that they found metal fragments in the remains when they were x-rayed, Frank said, "You'll find metal fragments when a body is burned in a car." But Frank claimed that he couldn't talk anymore about the case since it was still active at the time, even though the blank line on the autopsy report that he filed meant that the case was closed in 2005. And New Orleans Police Department also told CJ that they didn't investigate the remains of Henry Glover. But what's even crazier, but maybe not, considering what we've heard about police actions during Katrina, is that sources came to CJ with information on Henry Glover's case. They gave him photos of the scene. There were crime scene photos taken by officers at the 4th District Police Station with Henry's remains inside of the burned-out car, like skull and all. The car was parked hardly even a block from their station. In the end, only one person's charges stuck as far as Henry Glover's case went. Lieutenant Dwayne Sherman was acquitted for his part, and he was accused, as far as Henry Glover's case went, in aiding and abetting the burning of the car that had his remains inside. Same guy from the water truck situation and who beat Will and Edward senseless. Speaking of the water truck situation, Keenan McCann, who was the man shot by Lieutenant Dwayne Sherman and others in that situation, was actually allegedly lured outside by a phone call and killed after this happened, while there was a lawsuit underway where he was suing multiple parties. So do with that what you will. Lieutenant Robert Italiano was also acquitted, testifying that he wasn't given the information necessary for him to connect the dots between Henry Glover's shooting by a police officer to reports that he got of a dead body who arrived at their makeshift headquarters at Habens Elementary School shortly afterwards. He said, quote, "From the get-go, my conclusions, I know now that was wrong. Some of that belongs to me, but through the course of this trial, I've learned that several people withheld information from me that would have made a difference in what my actions would have been." End quote. Robert Italiano also said that he didn't remember many of the conversations government witnesses testified that they had with him about the shooting and cover-ups, or that he remembered those conversations differently. Officer Travis McCabe had his conviction set aside after a draft police report surfaced that seemed to contradict prosecutors' claims that he doctored the original report to make it look like the shooting was justified. Last I saw, he was trying to get his job back in the department. I'm not sure if he succeeded. David Warren, the man who actually shot Henry Glover, would be granted a retrial on appeal after serving just 3 years, and he was acquitted. After being acquitted, he would say that he did not regret his actions that day, and people have dragged out his actions that only took mere seconds over several years' time. David's lawyers got any video and photos of Henry's body and that sort of evidence blocked from being shown in court, along with any talk of a cover-up. They said they wanted David tried separately from the other officers they say covered up David Warren's justified actions, and they got their wish. David testified that he feared for his life when he shot Henry, and he said that he saw a gun in Henry's hands, and Henry and the other man ran towards the building that he was guarding. There were no weapons on either of the men. And as for Gregory McRae, he did not manage to get out of his sentencing like the others involved in Henry Glover's case. He burned Henry's remains and helped with the cover-up part of things, but his actions couldn't be attributed to the course of justice at all. In my opinion, it sounded like everyone else was able to get off due to technicalities, blocking evidence from being shown in court, and because they could claim their actions fell under this large umbrella of attempted justice or being clueless or scared for their lives. And Gregory's actions of burning a body don't quite fall under that. his attempts to get out got him resentenced to his original 17 years and 3 months for a multitude of things. After I think, but I'm not totally certain at all, that it had been knocked down prior to that attempt. But after that, it went back up to 17 years, which was his original sentencing. Dr. Anna Poe would actually go on to continue being a surgeon and a popular lecturer on ethical considerations in disaster medicine. In her lectures, she would change history, though. At one conference with almost 1,000 California hospital executives and health professionals, she claimed FEMA called them and told them that they were taking airboats at noon and that they needed to get whatever they could out of the hospital because they could no longer stay. And it would also say things like there was no clean water at Memorial, although you and I both know there was because investigators found water piled literally to the ceiling in the hospital. And it would suggest dramatic scenarios like she went through them in Memorial or something, posing questions about who would get the last bottle of water to audience members if they were in the position of being the person to have to choose. She said the Coast Guard helicopters arrived late on Thursday afternoon, even though they arrived early that morning and were even making rescues as early as Tuesday, and some even continuing overnight before the power failed in the early hours of Wednesday, even though Memorial staff were trying to stop them and eventually succeeded at doing so. Anna would still say that helicopters couldn't fly at night, and this is years after the banquet where she said the same thing. Remember, and she was corrected. She's still repeating that information. And maybe she still does, I don't know, but she would dramatize her experience to an untruthful degree according to fellow Memorial evacuees, telling other healthcare professionals these dramatic, questionable experiences and mixing them in with the story of her arrest to advocate for the need of immunity laws in the medical community. When showing her mugshot during these talks, she would say that she was arrested for making challenging triage decisions, not for allegedly murdering patients. She wouldn't mention injecting patients at all. She entirely left out that she, Dr. John Thiel, Sherry Landry, Lori Boudreau, Karen Wynn, and other doctors and nurses injected patients that all died shortly thereafter while boats and helicopter rescues were well underway. Anna mentioned her take on the questionable American Medical Association stances that healthcare professionals already don't even like, but for different reasons. She had issues with its ethical directive for doctors to serve in emergencies, even in the face of greater than usual risk. She advised those in such situations to restrict the media and use them to the best of their ability following a disaster. Which, here's my thing. It's the same stance I have on first responders, military personnel, or anyone in any career where you are agreeing to heal, serve, or protect before anything else, like you're taking an oath to do so. Do not go into that field, take that job, whatever, if you're not going to do what you're signing up for. Consider all of the possible bad along with the good. Like the police officers who didn't go in to save those children being gunned down in Uvalde, Texas. Wrong career, you shouldn't have joined. I know people who wanted to be police officers and they're scared of their own shadow or have like a Napoleon complex, but they watched too many cop shows growing up and for whatever multitude of underlying reasons thought that it was a good idea. Well, until I opened my mouth and convinced them of a career that aligns better and keeps the rest of us safe. Like, hello, what are you doing? Leave it for those truly cut out for the job. There's people who become nurses because it seems like a good payday, but they don't actually like caring for people and doing whatever they can to help save lives. There's firefighters scared of heights. And sorry to that man who went viral on TikTok. No matter how hard I laughed at that video, if you guys have seen it. But if you are scared of heights for whatever reason, and that video wasn't a joke or because he had to like trust other firefighters to hold him up by these ropes while he was in training and stuff, then you're in the wrong career. No one should lose their lives or be worried about the people supposed to help them because people going into these fields aren't considering all potential aspects of a job and decide that they would still like to do it. Although my 2 cents, that's really only part of what happened in these healthcare facilities and with police officers during and after Hurricane Katrina. Besides that, like Dr. Cyril Wetch said, sweeping this event under the rug sets a super dangerous precedent, a very bad one. It tells doctors that if you're in charge and you feel like giving a large dose of morphine and Versed are appropriate, to go ahead and do it, and it teaches young doctors wrong. The same is to be said for the police officers during this disaster. New Orleans Police Department has a history of corrupt officers, going back decades, doing robberies, rape, arson, killing, like to the point where people in New Orleans used to say that they were more afraid of police than the criminals, and that it was hard to tell the difference between the two. A New Orleans police officer in the 80s and 90s has since admitted to knowing officers who ripped people off, drug dealers. They robbed people. They killed people. I've been to small town Louisiana, and when I tell you in some of those towns, the officers will tell dealers that they're going to be raided before the raids happen. You scratch mine and I'll scratch yours. The paying people off. Just corruption. And I'm ragging on New Orleans and Louisiana right now because that's what this episode is about, but don't think for a second that it's only in that state, in that city. It's everywhere. When power dynamics go unchecked and people fail to question what they are being told, ordered to do, the morality of it, that's when cultures like this thrive. They thrive in secret or not, since locals to those areas half the time know what's happening, but they thrive easily and happily until something worse happens that forces it into the limelight or causes that culture to get better at hiding. Without the entire truth of the matter being widely known, I imagine this is just nothing but a moral toothache, like ethicist Arthur Caplan predicted. I agree with Virginia Ryder and Butch Schaefer's stance that justice doesn't always mean conviction. I mean, I think jail time should have been had for healthcare workers at multiple facilities based on these stories, at least losing medical license. I mean, come on. But those two said that the retelling of this story is important too, and they're right. More so, knowing why people react this way, under pressure or otherwise, is so important. Understanding that just because someone is a medical professional or first responder absolutely does not mean that they will act in the interest of those that they are duty-bound to help. It could be from a self-serving motivation, as shown through these stories many times over. It could also be from groupthink bias, as shown by the healthcare professionals who went along with what happened, the police officers who followed one after the other down corruption road, doing cover-ups, the media reporters who continued to push a disgustingly prejudiced narrative, and God knows who else. Just straight up racism on the part of some actions like the race killings, and a large part of media reporting. Groupthink is something I learned about in a communications class I took in college, and it's just stuck with me ever since. The textbook definition of groupthink is that it's a psychological phenomenon where the desire for harmony or conformity within a group leads to irrational or dysfunctional decision-making. This often results in members suppressing their own opinions and critical thinking to maintain consensus, which can lead to poor outcomes. Basically, people conform to the group opinion and ignore individual doubts or evidence because that's what everyone else is doing. And sometimes people do it knowingly, but a lot of times people do it unknowingly. I'm sure everyone can think of a time where a group you were in made a decision that didn't completely feel right to you, or you've heard a story from someone you're close to who said the same thing. But you or someone you know went along with it because the group decided. That's classic groupthink. You could have gone with it because you felt too intimidated to challenge the group, or just because it appeared easier than raising an objection. Some people have probably even thought something like, well, the group knows best, or something like that. If you've ever swallowed your individual opinion, knowing in your gut something isn't right, but you did not take the time to really think things through for whatever reason, maybe thinking that agreeing is the nobler thing to do, then you've experienced groupthink. Like I said, allegedly, it was evident in the decisions of those who stood by and just went along with what they heard, even if they knew something wasn't right, and cited decisions made by staff and leadership in Memorial, Life Care, Lindy Boggs, Trout Infirmary, New Orleans Police Department, the Mayor's Office, the District Attorney's Office, the Governor's Office, the National Guard, and so on and so forth. Doctors ordering the murder of patients so they can leave early, and because they're panicking over threats that aren't even truly affecting them at all. And to be so clear, so the message sticks, if you missed it, no one should have been euthanized. No one. There was absolutely zero reason for anyone to have been lethally injected. Rescues were going on for days before the injections, during the injections, and hours after the injections. These people did not agree to be killed. The reasons behind them being killed were so, ugh, like excuses. You know the saying, excuses sound best to those making them up. Like, it makes no sense. It makes no sense. And anyone who's like, I think that I would have wanted to be euthanized, or I wouldn't have wanted my family to suffer in this condition. These people were not suffering. They were hot. It's the South. It's swamp heat. They live in Louisiana. They know what they're getting into. Then you have those who didn't agree with murdering Emmett Everett, but didn't speak up to tell other staff that they were getting out Rodney Scott, so why not Emmett, who weighed pretty close to the same amount. Those who realized that they could have just busted the windows out and walked on the roof to get to the helipad instead of going up and down the stairs didn't speak up or advocate their cases. Like, to look at someone and go, you're too heavy to move down these stairs, so we're going to take you out. Please be serious. Memorial staff started injecting employees within 48 hours of losing power, and they still had food, water, and medications. So much of all of those supplies were stacked up to the ceiling or sent to other healthcare facilities. I mean, for goodness sake, the hospital was connected to a building that had power the entire time, and staff and leadership were in and out of there using its facilities. They were watching TV and making soup in the microwave. People evacuated at the National Guard's insistence because there were unsubstantiated rumors in the media helping push crime galore and snipers and shootings. When the majority of the shooting that was happening, which wasn't even a lot, mind you, was people just trying to get the attention of helicopters, or of course, the racist people shooting innocent Black people in Algiers Point because they knew they could get away with it. Anyone who agreed with what was happening was wrong, who didn't act out to stop it, besides Dr. Bryant King, the one or two times he yelled at the CEO to let people needing help into the hospital. But after that, he kept quiet for his own self-preservation, which I kind of get, but also, like, really? People who claim they didn't agree with what happened, like Dr. Kathleen Fournier, Susan Molderick, and more. I mean, Dr. John Thiel was described by so many coworkers and people who knew him as understanding, kind, gentle, etc. He trained for a while at Charity Hospital, where he was used to the order of operations being attending to the most critical first. It was weird for him to see the sickest at Memorial being prioritized dead last for rescue. Definite racism aside, he actually stopped to think briefly and ask nurse manager and head of the ethics committee, Karen Wynn, if they were even allowed to inject patients like that. He asked her if they really had to do it, but still went along with it. And aside from everything I've mentioned, there's also the deeper thought process that staff had at Memorial. There were conversations behind the scenes that I did not even get into in any of these past episodes talking about Hurricane Katrina and Memorial, where staff spoke on how they just didn't see life care patients as being worth saving, allegedly. Like, allegedly, there were talks and conversations about how the life care patients' life were being extended, quote, unnecessarily. How they were being dragged on and forced to stay alive. How when it's time for people to go, they should just be allowed to go. And doctors and healthcare practitioners should not be putting extra effort into extending people's lives, basically. And these conversations were happening well before Hurricane Katrina. So they weren't a new thought process being introduced to some of these staff members. I mean, it was even evident in the jury. One asked if they were the only one who felt like they were making a mistake before they returned the no indictment verdict. That juror could feel that they were not doing what should have been done, but they went with it anyway when they didn't see anyone else clearly and obviously agreeing with them. How is it that so many police officers and healthcare providers turned to alleged murder while other doctors, nurses, paramedics, and firefighters fought tooth and nail to keep people alive in worse conditions. How is it that Lieutenant Dwayne Sherman, who was seen going and rescuing people in flooded out attics and things like that after the storm, gets around his police buddies and within 2 seconds is beating people just trying to get help to smithereens? I mean, we can talk about how New Orleans' civilian population is predominantly Black. And that's a whole entire deeper lesson in history. But when it comes to these dynamics, it's not Black and white, it's blue. For many, as long as the uniform that they wear to work is on, in the case of police officers, it's blue against everyone else. Again, another completely deeper, separate conversation, but it's the same mindset for the doctors. Largely white coats against everyone else. Nurses against everyone else. When those who essentially hold others' lives in their hands and hold power in general, they go unchecked and they feel like they can only lean on each other, a cult mentality is formed. And if you can't see it or acknowledge it, you're probably part of it. Sorry to tell you. Anyway, I digress. The general fund of the state of Louisiana paid over $450,000 in legal fees and expenses for Anna's defense at her request. That amount reimbursed the LSU Healthcare Network and the Dr. Anna Poe Defense Fund. She would also opt in for a share of a $25 million settlement from Memorial and Tenants class action suit filed by patients, visitors, family members, and anyone else at the hospital during and after Hurricane Katrina. Many victims felt it wasn't enough for what they suffered, considering everyone who opted in reduced the amount that each party got. Anna got almost $2,100 for each day she was at Memorial. Some victim families wanted jail time for alleged perpetrators. Others wanted them to never practice medicine again due to breaking their primary oaths. Some had given up after the grand jury decision and just wanted real answers. They just wanted to know why. Some of the memorial staff I mentioned felt that they put their patients out of suffering and would want the same done for them. Those who supported Anna even said the same thing. But it strikes me how Dr. John Thiel also had the same stance. But when he recovered from his near-death experience, he was grateful to be alive. He stood by his decision, but suddenly being put out of assumed misery wasn't what he would have wanted. For Rodney Scott, who was so traumatized from his treatment that he refused to take off his street clothes the next time he was in the hospital, he said that it was worth going through everything he did to see his family again. He wants people to learn from Memorial's story that every single time you can save a life, save it. If they could get him out, they could have gotten everyone out, and what happened did not need to happen. There's a way for everything, and every option should have been explored. How can you say euthanasia is better than evacuation? If they had vital signs, you could evacuate them. Get them out, let God make that decision. That's what he would say. And he wasn't wrong. Like I said, they could have gotten Emmett Everett out. Like, please be serious. In no world does it make sense. And Emmett actually told his medical team to do whatever it took, including surgery, so that he could get as well as possible to go back home to his grandkids and wife. His death hit one of the nurses, Cindy Chatelain, the one who struggled with addiction, so hard that she spiraled into depression after and increased her use of narcotics and alcohol. She's the nurse that promised Emmett Everett that they would get him out. She died in her early 50s, her family says, due to how distressed she was over Emmett's death. Now, for as insane as the decisions inside of some of these healthcare facilities were, and while I say the deaths of many inside of hospitals and nursing homes throughout the city were the fault of the people who decided to kill them, allegedly, what led to everyone being in these positions for this to even be decided was not totally their fault. Susan Moldrick's sisters were nurses, and they told her the different facilities that they worked at during Katrina, the staff and leadership at those places made completely different decisions to those in Memorial. Some were without power and things like that, but their facilities worked tooth and nail to save everyone they could, similar to Charity Hospital. They had systems set up. But why Memorial and New Orleans experienced the flooding that it did, why the levees broke, why there just didn't seem to be enough rescue assistance for those needing help, how local, state, and government officials, some grossly unqualified, twiddled their fingers, more worried about their bottom line than saving citizens, and how and why there are still flood victim remains believed to be in houses throughout New Orleans to this day will be revealed in part 4. Even how choices at memorials shaped who gets saved today, and if family members are even informed about those decisions, and how and why so many are absolutely convinced the government flooded the city on purpose. But part 4 won't be released here. Next week will be an OG Occurrence episode. To hear part 4 and other soon-to-be-released bonus episodes, go to occurrencepod.com or use the link in bio to get exclusive and early access to bonus content and new episodes that won't be released anywhere else. Leave a comment on your thoughts, because I certainly have so many. Stay safe, and see you next week. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.